Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back. Really excited about today's show. And again, I want to give a quick disclaimer because we're going to go a little bit deep scientifically on today's podcast, but we're going to do that intentionally because we have a guest with us who is very much able to go deep on what really happens when we come down with heart disease. When we come down with heart disease, make it sound like a cold, but what's actually going on behind the scenes there? We have a surgeon with us who has performed about 5,000 coronary bypass surgeries, about 2,500 other heart surgeries, nearly 1,000 lung cancer and just general surgeries, and then again another 5,000 plus general vascular surgeries. So an individual who has literally thousands of hours of hands-on experience with diseased hearts and diseased arteries, and who better to tell us about what truly is causing this at a biological level than the wonderful surgeon, wonderful man, and author of The Cure for Heart Disease, Dr. Dwight Lundell. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It's wonderful to be on with you.
Well, again, Dr. Lundell, thank you so much for joining us, and it was truly a pleasure meeting you on the Low Carb Cruise. And one thing that really resonated with me about your talk on the Low Carb Cruise is it felt like I was a little bit back in university, which is all right because it was quite academic, but what you did so well was without editorializing too much, without getting ideological, without leveraging your personal preferences on what tastes good and what is and isn't moral to eat. You just stated very simply, here is the biology of what happens when your body breaks down from a vascular and cardiovascular perspective. And what I'm hoping is we could stick like just the facts. Let's focus on the biological facts and talk about what really causes heart disease.
All right. That'll be great. That's been my passion for 30 years.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, let's define heart disease for a minute to clarify that for all of the listeners. When we say heart disease, we're talking about atherosclerosis or plaque buildup in the arteries that feed the heart muscle. So, and symptoms occur, heart attacks and death occur when that blood vessel gets completely closed and causes heart muscle to die, which then generally leads to a fatal irregular heartbeat. So when we talk heart disease, we're talking about the arteries that feed the heart muscle and when they get plugged up and the consequences of them getting plugged up.
Excellent. That makes perfect sense. Let's keep going.
Well, the blood vessels really are the brains of the whole cardiovascular system. We attach lots of things to the heart of emotion and bravery and all those kind of things. He's got a heart, and the heart obviously is a wonderful thing. It pumps gallons and gallons of blood every hour and doesn't complain. But really the brains of the system that control everything, that send the blood where it's supposed to go, that keep it flowing, keep it from clotting, carry our nutrients around, carry the waste products back. So the thing that really controls where things go, when they go, how much goes, are the blood vessels. And the blood vessels are basically controlled by this single cell layer thick lining of that blood vessel, which is called the endothelium. Now, these cells, once again, single cell layer thick, but stop and think about it. Everything we take in, from air to food to water, etc., has got to go down this pipe through this little single layer to get to the rest of our cells. And all the waste products that we generate from metabolism have got to get around or through these cells to get back into the vascular system to be expelled as CO2 out of the lungs or passed out as urine or sweat or whatever it might be. So it's really the critical layer that controls the circulation and ultimately controls most of our metabolism.
And is something so when that layer starts to break down, is that when we start to see the first signs of heart disease and cardiovascular disease?
Yes, it's that's the key. That's without something bad happening to that single layer, then we would never get heart disease at all.
So what have you seen in your 10,000+ hours inside the body? What's causing this?
I was joking with someone the other day that I've seen more naked bodies than a pornography producer, but unfortunately, most of them were sick and in a desperate circumstance. So it's in that way, it's not funny at all. It's sad and tragic, but luckily we had some sort of simple mechanical ways to stave off the effects of some metabolic consequences on those blood vessels. And it was pretty frustrating to realize I was winning battles for these people, but ultimately we were losing the war on heart disease because we weren't paying attention to the fundamentals, and that is what goes on with this little layer called the endothelium.
And what is the misunderstanding? Why are we as a culture not paying attention to that? And what are we doing to continuously inflame it, for lack of better terms?
Well, we've been focused for the last 40 years on cholesterol and on controlling cholesterol with medications and attempting to control cholesterol levels in our blood with diet. And so it's the biggest conversation when we talk about health. How you doing? Oh, my cholesterol is great. Well, that just isn't the problem. And here's why it isn't the problem. Over half the people with a heart attack have normal cholesterol levels. Cholesterol is a substance we make in our own body. We produce it. It's not a toxic substance in any way, shape, or form. And we had sort of a simplified idea about, as long as we could lower this cholesterol, and the lower the better, then we were going to cure heart disease. Well, the interesting thing is that, once a diagnosis is made, then we sort of stop thinking about the problem. And this is what happened with heart disease. We stopped thinking about what was really going on inside this blood vessel. We were just looking at something we could measure and something we could change with a medication, that is cholesterol levels. But as we moved on from coronary bypass surgery, where we take a vein from the leg and detour around the blockage, as we moved to doing angioplasties, where we put a little tiny balloon inside there and inflate it to try to squash the plaque out of the way, when that failed, then was a time we stepped back and took another look at what really was going on in here. And this happened in the late 1980s and throughout the 90s. And finally, all the little steps along the way were elucidated, and we understood that the fundamental mechanism of atherosclerosis, that is the fundamental mechanism of cholesterol and cellular debris, etc., causing a plaque in the blood vessel, which ultimately had consequences of heart attack, stroke, etc., was low-grade inflammation. So you hit it on the head when you said inflame the artery, because it turns out that it is low-grade inflammation is the fundamental mechanism that starts the plaque, that makes the plaque grow, and ultimately makes the plaque rupture, which is what results in the disastrous consequences of heart disease.
So, Dr. Lundell, just to pause really quick and summarize and make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So, a couple things going in reverse order of what you just said. The fundamental cause, it appears, or the thing, like if we're going to measure anything and say, this is the thing you need to watch out for, if there is any one thing, the closest thing to fitting that bill is inflammation. And that is in sharp contrast to what we've been told to think about, which is cholesterol. And we can, I think we're all pretty familiar, at least everyone's listening to this podcast, about, Ansel Keys and fat phobia and how the whole cholesterol thing got started. But one story I wanted to share with folks, I'm curious about your thoughts on it, Dwight, is this little story where when you talked about we're so focused on cholesterol because it's something we can measure. And the story goes a little bit like this. So a woman is out for a jog, and her contact lens falls out. And then she, starts looking around for it, not having any success. And this other woman is sitting on a bench, and she sees the first woman looking around for her contact lens, and she wants to help her. And she sees that the woman who's looking for her contact lens is standing under a near street light. So she walks over to the woman looking for her contact lens under the street light and says, ma'am, looks, you're holding your eye. I noticed you stopped jogging. Did you lose your contact lens? And can I help you look for it? And the woman who lost her contact lens is very, very happy. She says, oh, thank you so much. Absolutely. It fell out about 10 feet back. And the second woman looks at her and says, I'm sorry, you said your contact lens fell out about 10 feet back. And the woman who's holding her eyeball is like, yeah, it fell out about 10 feet back, pointing 10 feet away from her. And the second woman says, well, why are you looking here? Why are you looking here if it fell out back there? And the woman who's holding her eyeball says, well, the light's better over here.
Yeah, that's a great story.
So it seems like that's a little bit with what's happening here with atherosclerosis and heart disease and cholesterol. Is that fair?
That is fair. I mean, we got if we can measure something and change something, we think we're doing it. But as a matter of fact, we're not doing anything. Is once again illustrated by the fact that half of people with a heart attack have a normal cholesterol level. So if focus back on inflammation, and I didn't say it was the cause. I said it's the mechanism.
Oh, the mechanism, yes.
And so what causes inflammation? And the answer is injury. Whenever we get injured, the biological response is inflammation. And this is a complicated cascade of events, which we don't need to go into, just to say that inflammation is the response to injury. Now, the classic signs are, if you remember when you got a scratch or whatever, it's redness, it's swelling, it's warmth, and it's pain. The classic signs: calor, dolor, rubor, right?
Makes sense.
So anyway, what happens is that chemicals are secreted by cells to call out our white blood cells, which are our defense mechanism, which come to fight the battle and kill the bacteria or carry away the dirt or begin to bring nutrients in and proteins and collagen, et cetera, to heal the wound. So it's a complicated process that starts with an acute aggressive response. And if we didn't have this acute aggressive response, we'd die from every little silly infection that came along. So be thankful for it. But normally inflammation goes into a resolution phase. So we heal a wound, like this sliver in your skin. It was red, it was warm, it was painful and swollen. And then it started to heal a day or so later. And ultimately it was gone. It might be a tiny minuscule scar, but it was gone. Well, so really it's a fundamental injury to our endothelium, and repeated small injuries to our endothelium that don't allow resolution of the inflammation. That's the cause of heart disease. And this is well worked out. The best paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Dr. Ross in 1999. The title was Atherosclerosis is an Inflammatory Disease. And the cellular mechanisms and all that, if anybody's interested, can look that article up. But so the real question for me then was, once again, I was winning battles but losing wars. So I stepped back and said, what's causing the injury to the endothelium? And there are many things that can do that. With cigarette smoking can do that. Chemicals of a variety of kinds can injure our endothelium. And these cells are relatively long-lived cells, and so it's hard for them to reproduce. And when they get injured, they don't do their function properly of dilating and contracting our blood vessels and controlling the flow and making sure it doesn't clot and delivering the nutrients to the right places at the right time. And that's what's called endothelial dysfunction. Not the ED that we see in the TV commercials, but ED, endothelial dysfunction. So in our modern society, we see that, we don't smoke as much as we did. Our air pollution is, in most places, it maybe is better than it was, but, we're still exposed to a lot of things, but you wouldn't necessarily stick your nose in you wouldn't smoke cigarettes, and you wouldn't stick your nose in the exhaust pipe of the diesel truck that's going by, and you wouldn't purposefully go injure yourself. So there are some things we can't avoid, but there are some things we can. And so we take a look at what is it that could injure my endothelium and repeatedly and cause this chronic inflammation, which is going to plug up my arteries and give me a heart attack. And the best answer is to look at not an exaggerated example, but an accelerated example. And that's the patient with diabetes. Almost all of them die of heart disease. They lose their vision, they lose their kidneys, we amputate their legs, but they do have severe heart disease. And so this would be an example of accelerated endothelial injury leading to this kind of disease. And lots of people have said that diabetes is an example of accelerated aging, et cetera. So people have said, well, this is a great example. What is it about a diabetic that might injure the endothelium and cause these problems of renal failure, blindness, amputation, and heart disease? And the answer is high glucose. That's the characteristic of diabetics. Their blood sugar is high, and their blood sugar is repeatedly high. And it turns out that the endothelial cell, now most cells have what's called an insulin receptor. They're responsive to insulin. When insulin is secreted by the pancreas in response to us eating carbohydrates, glucose is pushed into cells. And when the cells are full, they say, no, I don't need any more. And the insulin receptor is closed off. The insulin or the sugar pump, which we call a GLUT4 in most cells, shuts down. And so the cell can control what goes on inside. The endothelial cell and a few other cells don't have that same kind of insulin receptor, and they don't have that same kind of a glucose pump. So they're at the mercy of the glucose we have in our blood. Mm. And what happens is that all this glucose goes into the mitochondrion where we make energy, creates lots of free radicals, which overwhelm our ability to neutralize them. And that fundamentally is what injures the endothelial cell, is high blood sugar. And it doesn't have to be very high to start this injury process. And so when we look at diabetes, we see, it's a perfect example. And it drives me crazy when I see a big paper about hyperglycemic injury to all these organs and all the tissues and the endothelium. And then somebody wants to start creating a medicine or interrupt a pathway to stop this endothelial injury and stop the oxidative stress. And I go, I start beating my head against the desk here, reading an article. So why don't we just eat a little less sugar?
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lundell, what I so appreciate about what you just did, and hopefully what you will continue to do in this show, is you gave we're talking about science. This is medical science. We're talking about cellular mechanisms, and you stepped us through very, very objectively. Here is what happens. It's got inflammation. You've got cellular mechanisms. Repeated injury to the endothelial cells cause inflammation. Inflammation leads to heart disease. Well, what can cause repeated injury to the endothelial cells? Okay, what is the mechanism by which that injury can happen? Okay, well, what can we put in our body that can lead that nothing in there was a moral statement. Nothing in there was tied to environmental concerns. Not that those aren't valuable things to think about, but that's not what this conversation is about. If we're talking about the cause of a medical condition, that is a question correct me if I'm wrong, of biological mechanisms, which can be studied and demonstrated. And if we want to argue, in quotations, let's argue those mechanisms in a very specific, like if someone were to disagree with you, I would expect them to say, you just outlined a 8-step, I don't know if it's actually 8-step process. Step 4 is wrong, and here's why. Not attacking anything else. Like anything else is in some ways, I perceive, actually an admission that you're correct, because if you were wrong, why not just say, the science is wrong, here's why, and here's a paper that proves it. So I just, listeners, if you, as you're out there just perusing the internet, I would urge you to see other, like if someone's going to disagree with the Dr. Lundell or any good doctor out there, and they're disagreeing based on like distracting political type arguments, in some ways, to me, that's an indication that the person they're attacking is actually onto something, because they're not actually disagreeing with the argument. They're saying, oh crap, the argument is sound, so I have to argue about something else. So that's just a little, like if you study logic or debate in an academic setting, when you see people start to attack a person for things other than the argument itself, oftentimes that's an indication that their argument is sound. And when we're talking about biology and we're talking about people's lives, getting the science correct is pretty important, isn't it, Dwight?
Oh, absolutely important, Jonathan. Everything else is sort of a, as you pointed out, a political or religious discussion, if you will, because what I've said about the mechanisms, those can all be measured. They're worked out. It's not controversial. It's not promoting one medication or another, or it's not getting emotional about whether I'm eating a potato or a steak or saving the world or killing a plant or whatever. It's biology, and that's where it happens, is biology.
And biology, and I've been saying this is sort of one of our slogans here at the Smarter Scientist Slim. Biology isn't a matter of opinion. We can certainly debate and have wonderful debates about whether or not we should eat this or that because it's good for the economy, or because it's good for the agriculture, or because it makes the USDA happy, but those are all separate conversations. So everyone, please, if you ever start talking with anyone about this, or you read Dr. Lundell's book, The Cure for Heart Disease, and you start to share the science with people, or you check out that New England Journal of Medicine paper Dr. Lundell mentioned, or any textbook which will explain that this is how this works, please just let them know, hey, I'm not arguing anything other than biological mechanisms. So if you want to disagree with me, in quotations, please disagree with me on the same thing, on the same level that I'm talking about, meaning tell me why the biological mechanistic argument I'm making is wrong. Identify the chain in the biologic process that I'm talking about that's wrong, because until you do that, you're actually arguing in support of what I'm saying, because you are showing that you can't disprove it. And this gets me a little bit amped up, Dr. Lundell, because there seems like there's so much, like if we could just bring the science back into this, a lot of this confusion goes away. Let me give you a very simple example. Dr. Marian Nessel over at NYU, who's a brilliant researcher. Certainly, she and I have some different opinions about things, but she went on record stating one of her critiques of the USDA food guide pyramid is that it fails to recognize the biological equivalency of starches and sugars in the body. Like when, I don't care if you eat a potato, brown rice, a high fructose corn syrup, anything, like when it leaves your stomach, you got glucose coming out the other end. Like it's glucose. Your body isn't like, oh, bees made this. It's honey. I care. No, it's like the body just says it's glucose. So if we know glucose does certain things in the body, and we know certain foods turn into glucose, like what are we arguing about? There's not, am I missing something?
No, it's actually funny because it all turns into glucose. It's all broken down to that C6H12O6. It's glucose. And glucose is not evil. Let's not get drawn into that silly thing. We need some, and we can make some. Actually, to be absolute about it, we need zero, because we can make from protein and fat the glucose that we need for certain cells that require glucose. It's what happens. Let's go back to what I said about injuring the endothelium. And the endothelium starts to get injured when we get blood sugars above about 160. And maybe less, maybe more. Pancreas begins to get injured at those levels. Lots of other cells that can't defend themselves against high sugar. So really, if we wanted to measure something to see if we're healthy, we should measure, and honestly, Jonathan, to see what we should eat and how much we should eat, we should be measuring our blood sugars 30 minutes and 1 hour and 90 minutes after we eat some food. And then, and I'm praying for the time that we have, it's out there, but it's not approved yet, that we have glucose, that we have transcutaneous glucose monitors that show our blood glucose onto our smartphone. The device is available. That would be the greatest health tool ever.
And Dr. Lundell, I appreciate, again, you said here, like, glucose is not, this is not, again, we're not over here saying good, bad, evil, political. We're just saying, just like if you have excessive, like if you drank 20,000 calories of fatty acids, you could like distill down into fat and just drink, like that wouldn't be good to you. You'd have a abundance of that. And if you just took an amino acid supplement, or what proteins break down to in the body, and you just ate a 5-pound bag of amino acids, like that wouldn't be good for you either. So we all acknowledge that overdoing anything is bad. And I think all we're saying is find the level of glucose, and certainly so much of our diet, especially in Western cultures, breaks down into glucose. Find the level of glucose that will not cause repeated injury to your cardiovascular system, that will not cause inflammation and will not cause heart disease. Focus on that. Don't focus on arguing about politics or about ideological issues. What do you think?
Absolutely. Once again, that's the fundamentals, and we could, all these things are, whenever I say a headline, XYZ associated with this, or red meat causes heart disease, or eggs are healthy, or eggs are bad, or vitamin E is good, vitamin E is bad. You see all these headlines, and we must fundamentally remember as we read these things, even if we read the medical literature, Jonathan, association is not causation. That's where we got fouled up on the cholesterol nonsense. Cholesterol would never, ever be deposited in the wall of our blood vessel if it wasn't for inflammation. Period. That's plain biology. So the levels of cholesterol are relatively irrelevant. It wouldn't get there without inflammation. And many things can inflame the arteries, not just glucose. Although in our modern environment, since we've cleaned up lots of other things, to me, glucose is the easiest to control and the most important as we look at both heart disease, which remains the largest killer in the USA, and as we look at obesity and as we look at diabetes. The cause of all those is intermittent hyperglycemia, high blood sugars from over-consuming carbohydrates. You don't get hyperglycemic from protein. You don't get hyperglycemic from fat, but you do from a carbohydrate, a big gulp. You know, you see people walking out of the convenience market every day with one of these things. It's got 150, 200 grams of glucose. And we do a glucose tolerance test to see if you're diabetic with 50 or 75 grams.
And to be clear, that you keep people in the office while you're doing that, because that quote unquote high level of glucose, if not monitored after administering that, could cause problems to the patient, right?
Yes, it could. So, you know, and yet people are doing a super maximal glucose tolerance test 6 times a day.
I think they should have to put that on the big gulp container. Only consume this with under the watch of a physician. That's what you should be able to buy that big gulp, but only if you have a physician with you to monitor you.
That would be a great idea. I'm just cringed to see mothers bringing their babies out with big sodas and followed by a bag of chips. Once again, you like soda, but and you won't die from drinking a soda. But those kiddies are going to get hyperglycemic because it takes relatively little. When you stop and think that we have about 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved in our blood at any given time, even at a level of 100. And, you look at the big gulp and that's 30 or more teaspoons of sugar.
And folks, I really want you to let that sink in because it's pretty easy. Like if we're multitasking while we're listening to the show here, like let's, for 1 second here, what Dr. Lundell just mentioned and which is borne out in all sorts of research is at any point in time, you've got about a teaspoon of sugar, for lack of better terms, blood sugar, glucose, circulating in your body. So if you eat so that's 5 grams. If you eat 200 grams of glucose in a sitting, at least 195 of those have to go somewhere else. Where is that somewhere else, Dr. Lundell?
That somewhere else is it's got to go somewhere. And unless we really have very, very healthy insulin and very healthy cells that respond to insulin, our blood sugar is going to be high. And it's going to injure our endothelium and lead to heart disease. But the only place it can go is basically to the liver, to the muscle, and to fat cells. And so when the liver and muscle get full, there's only one place it can go, and that's to fat.
So when we look at it from a mechanistic or from the biological mechanisms perspective, when we overdo it in terms of insane carbohydrate, and let's be very clear, you ain't going to eat 200 grams of glucose if you're eating non-starchy vegetables. Like your stomach would explode before that's going to happen. So we're not saying anti-carbohydrate by any means. We're saying anti-concentrated, unnatural sources of glucose. So you eat all 200 grams of glucose, which is only physically possible if you're doing it through processed garbage or really, really starchy substances. You do that, you inflame your tissues because you've got super high blood sugar. And then after that's done, to add insult to injury, it goes into your fat cells. So it's like it punches your body in the face and then it just makes you fat. So that really doesn't seem like a fun experience.
So it's just that simple. And I love your mottos of make it simple. And we get all wound up in all this stuff. Well, you can't drink a sip of milk or have a piece of cheese or have some peas in your dinner or all wound up in this kind of stuff. It's what happens when we eat that's the important thing. What happens to what we take in? It really is critical. And really, I've heard references lately to some of the mummies that have been dug up to say, well, that proves that they were meat eaters or they were vegetable eaters, or that proves something, that some of these mummies had heart disease. Well, guess what? There's even mummies had things that could injure their endothelium, like living in a cave, breathing smoke all day long, having poor dental hygiene, having wounds that don't heal, having chronic infections, all of those kind of things. So to me, once again, those are silly arguments. Let's, as you say, let's stick to some biology and, if we want to get down to facts and be healthy, let's talk about biology. If we want to, entertain ourselves or get in arguments, let's talk about those other things.
Dwight, I think that to me is really the take home message of this conversation. And it's so important, listeners, that there's morality, there's politics, there's entertainment, there's sports, there's lifestyle, there's all these different areas. There's mathematics, there's mechanical engineering, there's also biology, and that is a science. And if anyone is going to say something biological in nature, for example, protein from animals causes cancer, but protein from plants doesn't. That, I would urge you, don't yell at that person, don't argue with that person, but just ask them biologically, what is the mechanism by which plant-based protein does not cause cancer, yet animal-based protein does? Because don't they both just break down to amino acids? So are you really arguing that some of the essential amino acids were, wait, what? So what is the mechanism? And if they can't answer that, they're not arguing about biology. They're subtly making a moralistic or an ideological argument and disguising it as a biological argument. What do you think about that, Dwight?
I think that's very, very well said.
Well, I appreciate that. And it just frustrates me because I think it is made out to be more complicated than it needs to be. Because, obviously the biology is hugely, pick up a biology textbook. It's complicated. But when you layer on all this other unnecessary editorialization, then it gets really complicated. And as you said, Dr. Lundell, people are dying. So we need to take a step back. And I think some of us need to maybe put our egos on the shelves. And even though, we said something at one point in time, and the biology may contradict that. Let's focus on the biology. Let's focus on saving lives, and let's not cloud that with anything else. Or if we are, let's say very clearly, I think this moral issue is actually more important than not getting heart disease, and that could be a very good argument. And let's have that discussion rather than arguing past each other. So I don't know. Sorry, I get on my soapbox here, so I'll quiet down. Well, Dr. Lundell, if you have to leave our listeners with any one piece of wisdom, because you shared so much wisdom with us so far today, what would that be?
Control your blood sugar.
I love it. I love it.
You can get a glucose, to get into the details, you can actually get a glucose meter for free from Abbott Laboratories, and then you can order the strips, and it's quite revealing. If we're going to talk about the future of medicine is really taking better care of ourselves, because the future of medicine for me is mixed. Some things are really, really bad and make me unhappy about my beloved profession. Other things make me proud, but I think we're going to end up with do-it-yourself medicine, and it's really quite simple. We should not, you wouldn't go out and purposely cut yourself every day. So why are you going to go out and purposely be hyperglycemic 6 times a day? And it's easy to solve. Get a glucose meter. The testing strips are relatively cheap. Test yourself fasting blood sugar. Test yourself an hour after you eat. If your blood sugar's high, you ate too much of the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you don't depend on a doctor, the doctors, for lots of reasons, they can't really tell you the truth anymore. And that's a whole nother podcast. But even though they might want to, they're forced to tell you must lower your cholesterol. They're literally forced to do that, Jonathan. And the treatment protocols for hyperglycemia have not anything to do with a proper diet. They have all to do with medicines and this and that and the other. Before we had insulin, we treated diabetics with a low carbohydrate diet. It's duh. Some of it drives me crazy. I was watching a big broadcast about insulin levels. Insulin is associated with this disease and insulin is associated with cancer. And I'm saying, what is it that makes high insulin levels? It doesn't come out of the sky. High insulin levels are the result of one thing: stimulating the pancreas with carbohydrates. And yet it's like you couldn't say the word.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lundell, I really think that gets back to if I have to leave our listeners with one thing, it's you made an excellent point about when you see all these headlines. You see a headline, you see anyone saying anything. My act like a 5-year-old. Ask why. Just keep asking why. If someone says new study just came out recently that said vegetarians live longer. Whatever. And if you actually read the study, it's not what it's actually saying is people that eat more vegetables live longer, which is completely different than saying that vegetarians live longer. But if someone were to say that to you, and I'm not bashing vegetarians by any means, I'm just saying the headline does not represent what the study actually says. Ask, okay, well, why are you saying that? Oh, okay, it's because one group ate more vegetables than the other group. Oh, okay, well, so it's not actually about being a vegetarian, it's about eating more vegetables. Okay, well, why is it that eating more vegetables does that? Oh, interesting, it's because you think it has these biological mechanisms. Why that? And if people can't go down, if they cannot follow you on that chain of why, stop. Because they're just like, it's not a biological argument. So just keep asking why. What do you think, Dwight?
Absolutely correct. My best professor always said, what is the evidence? And ask, what is the evidence? And how does it work? And why does it happen? And just on that note, you hear people quoting this study and that study. Well, 99% of them have read nothing but the abstract or a excerpt from the abstract. And when you realize that probably 90% of the medical research that's published today is wrong for one reason or another, or skewed one way or another. And this is from Dr. Ioannidis, who published a very nice review of it with mathematics and et cetera, in 2005. So just because it's published in a medical journal doesn't make it sacred truth. It makes it something that we need to look at. And when you say XYZ is associated with ABC, that does not mean causation. That means, is there a question? Why? And are they associated? Is it causation or is it something else? Sort of a silly example is that reading comprehension is directly correlated with increasing shoe size. That's a true statement.
Well, and that seems like that's not the core source of our issues here.
Well, increasing shoe size is associated with growing up and getting older and learning how to read. So it wasn't shoe size. It was learning how to read as we got older in elementary school. Maybe that wasn't a good example.
Oh, no, it makes total sense. It makes total sense. And I think that the key thing here, Dwight, is that folks just need to be don't let people confuse you. Obviously, correlation doesn't result in causation, but even I don't even think we need to go that far. Is just anytime you hear any headline or you see anything, just say why. Just ask why. And I think you hit the nail on the head here, Dr. Lundell. And at the bottom line, watch your blood sugar. And I think, living a healthier life doesn't have to be that hard. What do you think?
It's simple.
I love it. Well,
science of simple.
I love it. Well, Dr. Lundell, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing all of your insights. And folks, if you want to learn more about Dr. Lundell, please check out his book, The Cure for Heart Disease. And Dr. Lundell, thank you again for sharing just this biology with us today, because biology really isn't a matter of opinion. And I appreciate you stepping us through the underlying process.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you, Dr. Lundell. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's show as much as I did. And please remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Talk with you soon.